Introduction to Pharmacoepidemiology, Part 3. Learning objectives. Understand the elements of clinical trial. Identify limitations of clinical trials. Evaluation in humans. Double-blind trials. Let's start with the Food and Drug Administration. The FDA is the administrative body that oversees the drug evaluation process in the USA and grants approval for marketing of new drug products. The FDA's authority to regulate drugs derives from the specific legislation. If a drug has not been shown through adequately controlled testing to be safe and effective for a specific use, it cannot be marketed in interstate commerce for its use. It is the responsibility of those seeking to market a drug to test it and submit evidence on its relative safety and effectiveness. That's why Phase 1, Phase 2, Phase 3 studies are conducted by the manufacturing company, by the pharmaceutical company, because it's their responsibility to market the drug and start the approval process. In Jordan, we have another similar association called JFDA, Jordan Food and Drug Administration. It was established in April 2003. We have clinical trials unit, so any new hospital or any agency that applies for a clinical trial should register the clinical trial in this unit. لازم كل الدراسات السريرية تسجل عند دائرة الغذاء والدواء. Also, the clinical research law established in 2001, 7 contract research organizations we have in Jordan, 18 IRB committees. So we have King Abdullah University IRB, we have Jordan University IRB, we have IRB for the Ministry of Health, IRB for the military. We have 18 IRB boards and 12 of them are active. Clinical trials. So once a drug judged ready to be studied in human after results from preclinical data from animal studies, notice of claimed investigational exemption for a new drug, IND, must be filled within the FDA. The IND contains information on the composition and source of the drug, chemical and manufacturing information, all data from animal studies, proposed clinical plans and protocols, the names and credentials of physicians who will conduct the clinical trial, a compilation of the key data relevant to study the drug in man made available to investigators and their institutional review boards. Okay, all this will be available with the IND. Then we start with the clinical trials. If the FDA sees that there is a sufficient safety evidence from animal data, they proceed to human data. So we start with testing in humans is begun after sufficient and acute subacute animal toxicity studies have been completed. Chronic safety testing in animals is done concurrently with clinical trials. Usually 4 to 6 years of clinical testing, and all should apply to the Declaration of Helsinki that was released in 1964 that regulates the ethical principles. Now, clinical trials, the idea of applying a new drug, testing drug in humans, because this is what clinical trial is about. It's about testing a new drug in humans. A lot of ethical concerns should be considered and should be addressed before starting any study. As you can see here is the Belmont report. The Belmont report was released in 1974. It's the famous boundary for ethical principles in research. So the Belmont report attempts to summarize the basic ethical principles identified by the Commission in the course of its deliberations. The report is a statement of basic ethical principles that should guard any research in humans. What are the principles? 3 major principles: respect for persons, beneficence, and justice for all participants. These are the major boundaries of ethical clinical research in humans. that was after the Declaration of Helsinki that emphasized the ethical principles for medical research involving human subjects. So the four ethical principles are autonomy, respect for the person, beneficence. The proposed study or research should provide beneficence to patients, no harm, and justice to institutional review board. So in order to achieve the Belmont Report principles, each research should be evaluated ethically from ethical point of view by institutional review board, IRB, or independent ethics committee that is responsible about approving, monitoring, and reviewing biomedical and behavioral research involving humans with the aim to protect the rights and the welfare of research subjects. So المهمة الأساسية للجنة IRB تقييم البحث من ناحية إنه يكون مناسب أخلاقيا، بحيث إنه يكون ما فيه أي ضرر للمرضى، ما فيه أي نوع من الممارسات الغير إنسانية أو الغير أخلاقية فيما يتعلق في البحث. After the IRB approval, the researchers moved to phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 clinical trials. In phase 1 clinical trial, it observes the effect of drug as a function of dosage. So it's mainly concerned about determining the dose in humans. Small number of healthy volunteers, usually 25 to 50 volunteers that are healthy. Goal to find the maximum tolerated dose. In some cases, like cancer, AIDS, for example, drugs with significant toxicities, patients with disease are used rather than normal volunteers or healthy volunteers because there is a high risk of toxicity if it's used in healthy individuals. A non-blind, open study, and it detects the safety again and the pharmacokinetics, mainly the maximum tolerated dose, done in research centers by trained clinical pharmacologists. If we move to phase 2, in phase 2 studies, drug studies in patients with target disease to determine the efficacy. Does this drug really works? Does it achieve the indication it's supposed to achieve? Number of patients is more. It's range between 100 to 200. And this time we will use patients for this study, not healthy people. Single blind disease with a placebo and positive control. So what we mean by single blind is that only the patient don't know if his intervention or placebo. Detects broader range of toxicities. Again, we also detect toxicity and safety. Done in special clinical centers, for example, university. We move now to phase 3 studies. Large number of patients, thousands of patients, conducted to minimize errors caused by placebo effects, variable cause of disease, further study of safety and efficacy again, double blind and crossover technique. So it could be double blind, which is the famous study design, randomized double blind study. So randomized, we randomly assign patients to receive intervention or placebo or gold standard disease medication. Double blind, both the assessment or the physician and the patient don't know the regimen. Or crossover design. In crossover design, we have the patients serve their own controls, their own placebo. So for example, we start with a group of patients, they receive the medication intervention, the new medication, then there is a washout period, and then we move and give them the second medication or the placebo. So this is a crossover design. We usually use this design to minimize or reduce the sample size. In phase 3 studies, the investigators are specialists in disease being treated. If the results meet the expectations, application is made for permission to market the drug as a new drug application. So after the results of phase 3 studies, if the results are promising and everything is okay, you apply for a new drug application, NDA, for the release of the drug in the market. FDA review of NDA maybe take up to 3 years before they get the approval or refuse the drug to be marketed. For serious disease, the FDA may permit the extensive but controlled marketing of a new drug before phase 3 studies are completed. For life-threatening disease, it may permit controlled marketing even before phase 2 studies have been completed. Once approval to market the drug has been obtained, phase 4 studies begin. In phase 4 studies, which is post-marketing study, we continue to monitor for the safety, especially now the drug is going to be used in large population of patients, millions of patients. So the safety of a new drug under actual conditions of use in larger number of patients. Before in phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, in phase 3 studies in particular, it's a controlled environment, randomized controlled trial. We are controlling everything. How about when the drug is released in the market and millions of people are using the drug? In phase 4 studies has no fixed duration. Some rare toxicity are evaluated in this type of design. We also study in post-marketing studies the use of orphan drugs that are used for rare disease. In general, these type of drugs are difficult to research, develop, and market. So a lot of the grants from the FDA are given to study these drugs in post-marketing design. Generic drug. What we mean by generic drug? A drug product that is produced by any pharmaceutical company after the patent of the original drug is expired. Now it's going to be called a generic drug. As we study the clinical trials, what are the limitations of pre-marketing trials? A carefully selected subject may not reflect real-life patients in whom drug will be used. So before any study, we start with inclusion and exclusion criteria. We exclude a lot of other comorbidities in order to study the effect of the new drug. However, in real life, patients come with different comorbidities. So this is the major limitation. Study subjects may receive better care than real life patients. We take lab tests, we measure the patients, we follow up them, but in real life, this may be different. Short duration of treatment relatively. So, for example, a patient with diabetes, he's been using metformin for 15 years, different than a phase 3 study that studied the drug for 1 year or months, even sometimes months. Also, the sample size. The sample size is major limitation because the rare adverse effects are detected when the drug is used in larger population of people. So in pre-marketing trials, about 20% of drugs get a new black box warning after marketing because the adverse effects were not detected in a pre-marketing phase. About 4% of drugs are ultimately withdrawn from safety reasons, like celecoxib, for example. Patients groups like pregnant women, children are excluded from clinical trials, so all of these data about their use are not known until the drug is used in the market for a long time to obtain data about this drug. Phase 3 randomized clinical trials have a few thousands of people enrolled. However, the drugs will be used in millions of patients and the sample size limitations in general. Again, it's affecting the calculations of adverse effects. Off-label drug use should be monitored also because a lot of the drugs are used not according to the indications. So how about the off-label use of these drugs? Who's gonna study this effect? Short duration of clinical trials when it takes 10 to 20 or 30 years to show long-term adverse effect of a drug, for example. Again, this table summarizes the limitations of pre-marketing trials.